Okay, so this is our Simondon reading group. We unfortunately missed a couple weeks because of some technical issues with the recording, but hopefully this week's recording will work properly. So we're a couple sessions into the newly translated book, Imagination and Invention. So we're picking up from page 16 in the translation, if anyone is following along with us. So we're just a couple sections into the introduction. So there's the preamble, then the introduction, and we're into section B of the introduction. No, sorry, we're still in section A, 3 of the subsection 3 of the introduction. So what we've seen so far is so in the preamble, he gives a very quick sort of sketch of the sort of cycle of the image. His theory of the image is a cyclical one. So there's the image before the encounter with the object, and we'll see more on this as we continue with reading today. So this is just a brief sort of recap. But there's the image before the encounter with the object, so in anticipation. Then there's the image in the actual encounter with the object, so in perception. And then there's the image after the encounter with the object in memory. And then these sort of three stages of the cycle feed into the formation of a new cycle with invention. So invention produces a new object that serves to as the basis of new images. So this is the sort of cycle that he has in mind when he talks about this cycle of images. But then in the introduction, what we've seen so far is he wants to situate the image as an intermediate reality between these different pairs of disjunctions. So he looks at the object and subject pair. So the image is intermediate between object and subject in the sense that it's something that the subject doesn't have complete control over in its mental life or in its psychical life. So you find yourself returning to images without sort of having control over them, or you find yourself haunted by images, or images sort of come to you without your ability to control them. So this is something that's you experience as sort of arriving from outside in that sense. And he points to some ancient Greek testimony depiction of images as something that arrives from outside as another piece of evidence for this sort of intermediate nature of the image. Then he talks about the image as intermediate between concrete and abstract. So here we can think of the abstract term as something like a description of a situation or of an object. So you would take an object and then give a list of all the properties of the object, and this would be a sort of purely intellectual exercise. And then the concrete would be the sort of immersion in a situation in the sense. So he points to like an emergency situation where you might find yourself acting without even really reflecting on what the correct course of action is. You just respond in the appropriate way without thinking about it. And then the image is sort of intermediate between these because the image has a certain valence or what he calls a weight. So you can when he gives an example of sort of deciding what profession to follow. So you're thinking of, say, a teenager that is looking at what course of action to pursue, whether to go to university or to enter the workforce, or what fields to study. And this teenager might sort of evaluate the different professions or different courses of action by sort of weighing these different images. So you think of, if I become an engineer, what would my office look like? What would my sort of day-to-day life look like compared to if I became a doctor? What kind of images do I have of myself as a doctor, or as a writer, or whatever other sort of course of action that person is contemplating? They have these images of what that life looks like, and they sort of weigh these images against each other. And this is intermediate between concrete and abstract because a purely abstract just description of what an engineer, what properties does an engineer have, you can't really weigh that against the description of a doctor, what properties a doctor has. You can't, you can make a list of those properties, but then to make a decision between them, you have to give some sort of valence to these properties. You have to say that these properties are good and these ones are bad, or these are better than these other ones. And so this is what Simondon sees the role of the image as doing. So you can only make a decision in the proper sense through through the use of images. You sort of weigh the images against each other, and you find yourself attracted to one image versus another image that you find less attractive or repulsive. And So this is how Simondon conceptualizes or pictures the decision making process. And so again, this is sort of intermediate. This is not counting situations where you find yourself acting without making a decision or without thinking about what to do. But this is, situations where you actually sort of reflect and have to choose between different courses of action. And then the next one, the one that we're going to continue reading today, the next opposition is the opposition between past and future. And so the image is intermediate between past and future, or there are sort of past and future aspects of the image at the same time, in the sense that the image sort of points back into memory. Simondon appeals to the work of Hippolyte Taine, who was a philosopher and psychologist of the 19th century. Taine's theory of the image is one in which our sensations provided image, or produce an image, and then that image has a sort of inherent capacity to persist or to be revitalized or re-imaged, I guess. So you look at the table, you see an apple on the table, you close your eyes, you still have this sort of image of the apple that persists in your memory, or that you have this tendency to sort of re-image that apple. But this tendency, this tendency sort of left to its own devices would produce hallucinations. You would keep seeing that apple no matter where you looked, whether you turn around and face the other direction or whatever. But this tendency towards hallucination is countered by the stream of incoming sensations and incoming images from other aspects of the situation. So when you look at the apple and then turn around and look out the window or whatever, this sort of tendency to reproduce the image of the apple is countered by the stream of new images coming in from outside the window. In our sort of normal life, we don't have constant hallucinations because we have this constant stream of new images coming in to counter this tendency towards persistence of the image. But then there's also the image. We'll see this today, so I won't go into this in a lot of detail. But there's also the anticipatory aspect of the image. So this is the other side, the image, the sort of future aspect of the image. So we'll go into this as we start reading today. But yeah, so the image is intermediate between past and future in the sense that it has both aspects. It sort of points back towards the past. It has a tendency to sort of persist into memory and be revivified. And then it also points into the future. It has a tendency to anticipate the future. So that's a quick sort of summary of what we've done so far in the first couple weeks. And then we can pick up from page 16 and keep reading about the anticipation. So I'll let someone else read the first page or so because I've just been talking a lot. So if someone else would like to read that.
I just wanted to say real quick about the past and future mediation and the point about the image that, like the after image of an apple that is retained when you turn away from the object. I wonder how this would play out on the three different registers that he introduces a little later on, the instinctual, psychological, and dialectical, and if there would be sort of an equivalent sort of past-future mediation on each of those registers. Hopefully he goes into what that might look like.
Yeah, that's a good question. So we'll see that in, I think we should get to that part today in the section B of the introduction. He's going to go through these different sort of processes through which the image develops, and they each are related to different moments of time, so the past, present, and future. So let's hold on to that question, and we'll see maybe a little bit more in the introduction, and then further in the text itself when we get to that part of the text, and when he goes through that theory in more detail.
That sounds good. I can read. Are we at conversely?
Yes.
Okay.
Right at the top of page 16. Yeah.
Conversely, the image is the basis of anticipation, allowing the prefiguration of near or distant futures and symbolic attempts at solving anticipated problems. The activity of anticipation differs from the use of the image as memory in its meaning and mode of deployment. In anticipation, the reductives are less effective, and there can be an amplifying proliferation of images, comparable to what happens in La Fontaine's fable, where Perrette already sees the, quote, calves, cows, hogs, chicks, unquote, until the milk jar shatters, acting as a violent reductive. The imagination of artists and writers can preform a new state of society, a new face of life, as we find in Roman d'Anticipation. To a greater extent, invention is so strongly stretched toward the future that it brings to existence, outside of the subject, a new mode of reality. Nonetheless, it is quite rare for imagination to be either purely reproductive or purely creative. The evocation of the past is a new life, schematized differently than the old life, polished and formalized by active memory, as in engravings of historical scenes or the Épinal prints celebrating the legend of the Napoleonic era. Such an evocation presents ideals, vehicles for values, and projects itself into the future as an example to be followed by future generations. The memory image seeks to reincarnate and perpetuate itself. It carries a subjacent anticipation and, to a certain extent, does violence to the present in guiding it to open itself toward a future of revival, reviviscence. Anticipation, in turn, reprises old dreams and contains the echo of old aspirations already materialized in old object images, such as anticipations of human flight and travel, quote, towards celestial signs, unquote, to which the legend of Icarus and the Promethean adventure correspond. For humans, the wing is as much a memory as an invention, remembrance as much as anticipation. For collective life, too, the image incorporates part of the past and can make it available for prospective work precisely to the extent that the mental images materialize themselves not only through processes of cumulative causality, but through paths of invention, creating aesthetic, prosthetic, and technical image objects. Forward planning in collective life, in corporations, even nations, corresponds to the function of projects in rational anticipations in the short, mid, and long term. There are specialists in forward planning according to the time span under consideration. This effort of collective rationalization of the gaze projected into the future is one of the characteristics of the world today. During the last century, appeals to the future were associated with a strong affective and emotional charge, colored by social ideas and inflated by hope. The dimension of the future remained mythical and contained a veiled recourse to transcendence, a haven for longing towards eternity. Only the past had become a topic of science for scientific historians. The necessities of long-term forecasts, prévision, for action have introduced rationalization into the dimension of the future and have driven out mythical thinking, at least in the domains of economics and demography. Time begins to be organized like space. The future is annexed to knowledge, and no longer the privileged field of the optative, of desire or volition. Nonetheless, the image recovers its density and force, which carries it towards the anticipation of the collective future, beside and beyond the prospective rationalizations, which are not true inventions, but extrapolations. So yeah, this is interesting, this idea that the reductives that prevent the persistence of the image of what you were perceiving just a moment ago to continue indefinitely doesn't really apply, or doesn't apply as strongly to anticipations, which is how you can, I guess, get utopian visions or artistic expressions of utopia. And then it seems like there are these limit cases where the image, it's usually not purely past or purely future, but there's a sort of, the future runs towards the past, or the past is experienced now as the past now, rather than, like actually living in the Napoleonic era. And I'm curious about this reference to rational planning. It seems like he denigrates this kind of projection a little bit. And it's, I don't know, kind of like a truncation where you don't really have the same kind of projection into the future. And instead you have this anticipation, which I wonder if he's saying that, or the extrapolation, which may be kind of an aggrandizement of the present at the expense of the other temporal moments.
Yeah, I think this is a pretty rich passage. There's a lot of things that are going on here. So maybe I'll start with the bit about anticipation. So he's referring here, his example comes from one of Aesop's fables, where, if I remember correctly, this young woman, Perrette, she has her jug of milk that she, has just gotten from her cow. And she's sort of picturing, I'm going to sell this milk at the market, and then with that money, I can buy some chickens, and then with those chickens, they're going to produce eggs, and I can sell those eggs and buy a pig, and so on and so on. So each sort of step, she sort of pictures every step leading to another, further step of greater and greater wealth and happiness. But then she, knocks over the jug or drops the jug, and all the milk is spilled on the floor. Right? Yeah. There's a nice image of this story. Um, um, and So the idea here is that each anticipation, each image of the future, unlike in the case of the past, where we are sort of where the images of the past is countered by the stream of incoming sensations. Here, in the case of the future, we have each image sort of leads on to the next one. It sort of builds on itself. The imaging process builds on itself, and each stage or each moment of this process sort of points forwards to the next one, and it can sort of run away with itself. And Simondon sees this same type of process as at work in artistic creation, in particular in cases of what he calls here roman d'anticipation. So this would be, we can think of science fiction writing as an instance of this, where you sort of take today's technology and the research that's going on today, and you sort of anticipate what it's going to look like in 100 years or 1,000 years or whatever time span. And Yeah, so I think utopian projections would fit into this model as well. So you sort of take some sort of anticipation of what progress society is going to make in the next 50 years or 100 years, and you sort of feed that into itself and see that realization of that process in this utopian society of the future. But then, yeah. So the next bit. So he's given us first the sort of pure account of the memory image, or the image that tends to persist in memory, and then a sort of pure account of the anticipation image, the anticipation of the future. But then he says that most images are neither one nor the other. They have both qualities at the same time. So he talks about how when we have images of the past, when people bring up say the Roman Empire, and give depictions of what life in the Roman Empire was like, or what Julius Caesar did, or something like that. These images are meant to serve as, or are often used to serve as, examples for future behavior. So we're either meant to say, the Roman Empire was great, and everyone should, behave in a similar manner, or we're meant to sort of reject what the Roman Empire was like and say we should avoid what they did, or something like that. In any case, we're always using these images for our present purposes, or to modulate our future behavior. So we use the past to affect what the future is going to be like. And then conversely, all our images of the future. So Simondon points to images of flight, for example, which for most of human history were futuristic images, or anticipations of the future. Our images of flight are also tied to these sort of ancient myths, like the Icarus legend, where human beings, try to copy birds and use this sort of memory of what bird flight looks like as a guide to anticipate the future of human flight. So in both cases, you have images that sort of maybe have a predominance of one side of anticipation or memory, but at the same time work to affect the other side. So the memory, an image that might be an image of the past, it works to affect our anticipation of the future, and then an image that is primarily an anticipation of the future, it sort of draws on the images from the past to formulate that anticipation of the future.
There seems to be a move between the mythical past, an exhortation to improvement. In the present, mythical is displaced; it's got rid of in the interests of planning and things like that. It seems to me that the image is kind of at the mercy of all these developments. It seems has this capacity to change according to the needs and the desires of the society or the elements of society that are using it.
Yeah, so that was the next bit that I was going to get to, is this collective use of the image. So the first couple of paragraphs of this subsection, he's talking about, or he's sort of focusing on the individual use of the image, and so how an image subsists in individual memory, and how it sort of serves as an anticipation of individual futures. But we also have these collective uses of the image, both in the past and in the future. So we have collective depictions of the past, in the sense of we have sort of a collective memory of what things were like 20 years ago or 100 years ago. And often these memories are colored by, or in general, these memories are colored by our sort of social interests of today. So some people might think, everything was much better 20 years ago and things have gone downhill since then. Other people might think, we've made a lot of progress in the last 20 years and things are better than they were. And so the sort of selection of one of those images, or selection of one of those ways of depicting the past, sort of has a social valence as well. So it's not a neutral decision between those two images of the past, and you're using those images of the past to bring about a certain kind of future. Whether it's, you might think that we should return to the way things were 20 years ago or 100 years ago, and other people might think, we should build on the progress that we've made in the last 20 years. And so you're using those images to try to bring about a certain kind of future. And then likewise, we have an image of the future that builds on our understanding of the past. So you can have a sort of mythical understanding of the future, where you sort of see the future as a sort of open domain of whether it's limitless progress or a constant increase of happiness or something along those lines, a sort of utopian image of the future. And then Simondon is also pointing here to what he sees as a relatively new development in his time, which is a scientific forecasting of the future. So he's thinking here, he mentions demographics and economics. So you can look at trends of population growth, for example, and say that in 30 or 50 years, the population of this country will be X, based on the trends of population growth up to this point, and comparing it to other countries and so on. So you can have like a scientific prediction. Obviously, you can't be 100% accurate, but you can have a scientific prediction, or a prediction that is meant to be scientific, of what the population of a certain country will be in X number of years. So this is a much different kind of image of the future than when you just sort of imagine what your favored social arrangement will be in some vague future. So you're using precise calculations and collecting data and so on to produce this image of the future in the scientific sense. And yeah, I think Simondon sees this development away from myth and towards scientific prediction as having certain perhaps dangers to it, in the sense that it can potentially close the door to alternate futures if you are only ever depicting the future, or your only images of the future are the ones that are based on predictions from current trends, or based on the tendencies that have led up to the current moment. Then you're sort of foreclosing the possibility of some more complete transformation or more thoroughgoing transformation. You can only ever work towards something that our society is already tending towards. You can sort of manage the growth of population in relation to current trends, but you can never have a sort of decision for an alternate arrangement of society, or an alternate sort of behavior of society as a whole. And so I think Simondon sees this sort of closing off of myth as, on the one hand, sort of a rationalization, something that you can have a better understanding of the future on the one hand, but then on the other hand, potentially foreclosing the possibility of other options that are not necessarily already sort of pre-delineated in the current tendencies of the recent past and the present. So yeah, it's a sort of double-edged sword, I guess. This sort of rationalization of the future.
I think his antagonism towards the planning, the rational planning, to be that nothing new comes from it. He talks about they're not true inventions, but extrapolations. And what he's saying about anticipation of the future, it's kind of almost ideal of the image within that process, is that it creates new society. It creates something new. Something new will emerge. As this kind of scientific use of the image is kind of using it for its own ends, which are planning and allocation of resources, etc., etc.
Yes, I think that's right. There's a the idea here is that invention is something that is not sort of pre-delineated in what comes before. So this could be invention in technical inventions, or artistic creation, or in this case a social political invention. So this invention, or this new element, this new creation, is something that can't be entirely sort of predicted or prefigured in what is already existing now. If you had a knowledge of art in such a way that you could predict what kinds of art people would be creating 5 or 10 years from now, I think we would see this as a kind of a lack of creativity of that art form, or an absence of creativity in that domain of art. And likewise, if you can predict the development of society in all its detail for 5, 10, 50 years, we would see this as a kind of lack of creativity in the social political domain. And so for Simondon, there's this idea that creation or invention requires something that can't be entirely predicted from what is currently in existence, or trends from the recent past. This is the idea here of an invention in the social and political domain that he's using, or that he's working with. Okay, so let's go on to the next page. Let's see. So we can read up to the section break. So if someone else could read from science fiction up to the section break. We have no volunteers. So in that case, I can go again. But yeah, hopefully it's nice if we can get some volunteers for the next reading after that. It's just good to have some variety in the recording, but no pressure if you don't want to or don't have a mic at the moment. Okay. Science fiction is one of the ways the image recovers its futural power, that is to say, its prophetic function. Science fiction is the image of the real world grasped as a tendency and pushed further, truly anticipated, grasped prospectively in its cognitive and emotional aspects rather than merely supposed. What is lacking for forward planning to become an actual anticipation? An actual anticipation is this qualitative power, this physis that bestows on the future its true dimension of a development in process. To foresee, prévoir, is not just a matter of seeing, but of inventing and living. True forecasting, prévision, is to a certain extent a praxis, a tendency to development of an action already begun. The image as a reservoir of oriented emotion linked to a specific knowledge ensures this continuity of the act faithful to its own progression. It adds to forward planning a proactive force. An old and forgotten form of the image is that of religions, particularly in the prophetic act as well as in sacrificial practices. Religions, however, are modes of being according to which past and future communicate and lend each other their force through the constituted image. What was destroyed will come back. What had died will be reborn. What was corrupted will bloom again in an immense cycle. In Maccabees, as one of the first followers is ready to die, drained of his blood, having ripped and thrown his intestines to the crowd, he shouts out that God will bring him back to life and he will be reborn. We can also recall the biblical saying, unless the kernel of wheat falls into the earth and dies, the painful consummation of the past prepares a rebirth. Death prepares a birth. The complete image of death declares and prophesies the call of a birth. The blood of martyrs is the seed. Prophecy as a verbal image accompanies and expresses this subterranean cycle that runs from past to future the way fall cycles into spring. This order of third reality is neither fully perceptible nor entirely conceptualizable. The study of the image in this area must be complemented by the evocation of the myths of becoming, like the high road and low road among ancient Greek philosophers, the rhythm of conflagration and deflagration, the return of the great year, and even the notion of nemesis. Part of the reality of groups is made of images, materialized as drawings, statues, monuments, garments, tools, and machines, as well as turns of phrase, formulas like proverbs that are true verbal images, akin to slogans. Such images ensure the cultural continuity of groups and are constant intermediaries between their past and future. They are both vehicles of experiences and knowledge, as well as specific modes of waiting. So maybe a translation point would be the first one. So they included in the translation here some of the a couple, the French word for a couple of these for foresee and forecasting. So prévoir and prévision. So in French, with in the English sort of at least in the word foresee has this as well. So in French, the word prévoir includes the word voir, to see, and then likewise prévision includes the word vision or vision. So forecasting and foreseeing, as he says here, it's not just a matter of seeing, but of inventing and living. So one sort of way of understanding forecasting that he wants to sort of delineate himself from, or to separate himself from, is one in which you would just sort of look at the data and see what the future is going to be like. This is a sort of a vision or a depiction of forecasting that he thinks is a kind of limiting one. He sees what he calls true forecasting. He says it to a certain extent is a praxis, a tendency to development of an action already begun. So when you make a forecast, you're just by virtue of making that forecast, you're performing a certain action. And this is something that economists deal with all the time, where if you have an economic model that says the future interest rate will be X, and you publish your paper, then actors in the market can read that paper and then use that knowledge of, or that prediction of what the interest rate will be next year, and make economic decisions, and they sell or buy bonds or whatever based on that interest rate prediction. And that action based on that prediction might end up changing what the interest rate turns out to be. So there's, again, this sort of cyclical nature where by making a prediction, you're intervening into the social situation in a way that might end up either realizing that prediction or derealizing or preventing that prediction from coming true. So prediction itself is an action in general, in the sense that it affects society or the situation that you're intervening in some way. And then also the specifics of the type of prediction you make. So what data you use, what modeling methods you use to make your prediction. Like you're always making decisions. Whenever you make a prediction, you're making decisions about what information is relevant to that prediction and how you're going to use that information to make your prediction. And so that those decisions are themselves a kind of action. You're acting in such a way as to select a certain kind of prediction as being the relevant one, as opposed to some other kind of prediction that you might have chosen. And so that decision to select certain kinds of data and not others is again a sort of a kind of action. You're intervening in a way that highlights or emphasizes this kind of data as opposed to this other kind of data. And so, yeah, so Simondon sees this foreseeing or forecasting as a kind of action. So it's not purely contemplative. It's not just looking at the data and then seeing the results or seeing what the projection is going to be for next year's interest rate. You're actually performing an action just by virtue of making a prediction. And so he sees science fiction as sort of having this active nature or this active character in a way that more scientific predictions kind of obscure or don't emphasize. So the science fiction novel or the science fiction story sort of emphasizes this active nature, this character of having performing an action by making a prediction. So by writing a novel that depicts the future in a certain way, you might guide society to either approximate towards that future that you predict or to turn away from that future that you predict if it's a dystopian future. So you are intervening in the development of a society just by virtue of making a kind of prediction.
I think the key seems to be connection between knowledge and emotion. That seems to be the key. Because in terms of science fiction, it talks about it. He says, it has this. He calls it prophetic. The notion of prophecy. This first paragraph is to have this connection. Seems to combine the knowledge and understanding with an emotion. So there's science fiction is the image of the real world grasped with a tendency and pushed further, a truly anticipated grasp, effectively in its cognitive and emotional aspects rather than merely supposed. So it has that kind of anticipatory aspect of the planning, but it combines that with the kind of a more emotional understanding as well. He says what is lacking for forward planning becomes an actual anticipation in this qualitative power, the thesis, this phusis that shows the future, its true dimension of development process. Anyway, so it's not just a matter of seeing, inventing and living. I think this practice is the thing which combines these two. So the image, and this is where I think he's bringing out the kind of the function of the image, because the image is a reservoir, oriented emotions linked to a specific knowledge. So it has the image power, rather than being, I mean, what I said earlier, it seems to me that the image up to this point, something that is used, it's just something we can use for our own advantage in different ways. It wasn't clear how that use was enabled, but what he's saying now is that he's talking about the prophetic use of images, and it seems the prophetic combines the rational with the emotional. Seems to be saying, well, he says that the image contains that reservoir of oriented emotion, so it's oriented its emotion towards something, into a specific knowledge. This is, in a sense, why they lend themselves to this prophetic praxis, or this prophetic, let's use another word instead of that. But yeah, so it adds to planning a proactive, not only just planning, but it has this notion of activity in advance as well. I can think of a better way of saying that.
Yeah, this notion of prophecy is an interesting one, or the prophetic function of the image, and that's what he sort of goes into in a bit more detail in the next couple of paragraphs here. He talks about the prophetic role of images in religion, and so he's sort of comparing the prophetic role of images in science fiction, or our sort of mythological relation to the future, with the prophetic role of or the role of prophecy in religion, and so these are images that he talks about in relation to birth and death in particular. So this image of death as a precursor to a rebirth, or this sort of prophecy that what seems to be lost in today's action, or what seems to be a failed action, will sort of in the future it lays the seeds for something that will succeed in the future. I mean, of course, there are various different ways of understanding this kind of cycle of birth and rebirth. So, in the case of the biblical text that he's pointing to, it's a resurrection of the dead, which is a sort of one-time event. But he also talks about ancient Greek notions of the great year, and so we see this in Heraclitus, for example. This notion that there's a sort of cosmic cycle of the universe after many thousands of years. Everything sort of returns to how it was at the outset, and goes through the whole cycle of creation again. So there's this kind of constant circulation of entities, and so these images of these prophetic images, or this prophetic use of images, kind of point towards a future that will sort of that will justify the suffering of the past and the present. So the death of the martyrs today will lead to resurrection in the future, or plants the seed for resurrection in the future, or something along those lines. So yeah, this is obviously a very powerful emotional valence of an image that we can sort of lose sight of when we focus only on this rational cognitive prediction of the future. So if we only ever experience the future or anticipate the future in terms of rational predictions of what the population is going to be like, or some other sort of demographic prediction of the future, then we never experience this anticipation of the future in this prophetic mode, or this much more emotionally powerful mode of experiencing the future, and we never have this much stronger relation to the future that might lead us to make sacrifices in the present for the sake of the future, or something along those lines.
Yeah, this reference to the religions at the end of that section. One thing I want to just think about as we go through this book is, what is the relationship between, because in a couple of places he emphasizes the cyclical nature of the image, or associates the image with cycles. And yet I think invention is supposed to be something that breaks out of an old cycle, or gives rise to a new series of cycles. And so the relation between like the idea of the great year, or something like the Eleusinian mysteries, these seem to be cycles that sort of return to where they departed from. And I'm interested to see how imagination as generative of the new plays into that.
Yeah, that's a great point. This is something that we've talked about, I think, in our discussion of individuation. Is what exactly is the relationship between new and old in invention or in creation? Because if you think of invention as something like 100% novel that has no relation whatsoever with what came before, then it's not even really an invention. It's just something random. It's a random event. An asteroid striking the Earth or something like that is your sort of paradigm of an invention, which seems sort of paradoxical and not really what we mean by an invention. When we think about invention and creativity, we think of sort of building on what came before and using what came before in a new way, a way that other people didn't think of or didn't have the means to realize, or something along those lines, as opposed to something that has no relation whatsoever to what came before. So there has to be some sort of relationship between the novelty and the conservation of an invention to make it into something that's a real invention, and not just a sort of random occurrence that has no connection to what came before. So yeah, it is an interesting question that I don't think Simondon ever sort of directly addresses, but there's a lot of points in his work that sort of connects to this question.
I think it seems to be that the religious is another form of another form of image. He says it's an old and forgotten form of image. And he said it's based, from what he's saying, it seems he means by that it's cyclical. It's based on these cycles of birth and death, of decay and renewal, etc., etc. That's I would say it's another type of image. He says the third reality. I'm imagining he means by that it's another type of image. I think the area this seems to be in is a kind of the mysterious, because it's not fully perceptible nor entirely conceptual. It's neither open to either kind of immediate understanding as an image, or then get to analysis, thought, or actually.
Yeah, I think I'm not sure it's a new kind of image as so much as a new use of an image, or a different way of experiencing images. So that there's a kind of you can use a certain image of death and rebirth, for example, in a religious way. So it's a kind of use of an image as a prophecy, as an orientation for future action, in a way that is not sort of based on a cognitive appreciation of the future. So when you have a religious relation or a prophetic relation to the future, you're not sort of looking at the past and present and trying to come up with an account of what the future is going to be like based on that evaluation, this cognitive evaluation of the past and present. You instead have this affective or emotional relation to the future, and you use that to bring about a certain kind of future. So you have this valorization of either this is a future that we're trying to create, or this is a future that we're trying to avoid. That sort of structures your action to bring about the kind of future that you're trying to bring about. So this is a certain use of the image to bring about a certain kind of future, and it has this very strong emotional resonance in the present in a way that a rational or cognitive prediction of the future doesn't necessarily have.
Do you think the religious though has that as that function? Because it would seem that that's more to do with the science fiction use of images, where the religious doesn't have that element within it.
I think in the case of the Maccabees example that he's talking about here, so partly, and I think I don't really know the Maccabees story that well, but this martyr for the Maccabean revolt, in his sort of faith that he's going to be resurrected, he is or this prophetic call for resurrection is also at the same time an evocation of resistance in the crowd. So the crowd should resist the Roman rule over Judea, and should return to the religious practices of their ancestors, and so on. And so this prophetic use of the image has this emotional resonance in the present, but that resonance is directed towards a transformation of action in the future. So, and then religion in general has to do with any sort of religious revival or rebirth imagery. Always has to do with a transformation of the future as well. So people that undergo a conversion, for example, they might get baptized or undergo some sort of symbolic rebirth, and this symbolic rebirth is supposed to be the start of a new life. You live differently than you did before you converted, or before you underwent your baptism, or whatever ceremony. And it's that new life that comes after that is sort of motivated, or is gets its energy from this affective charge, or this emotional charge of the present, of the future in the present. So it's because I have faith that I'm going to be resurrected, for example, that I might choose to live in a certain way, and follow certain tenets and so on. So if you it's through this prophetic relation to the future that you gain the desire and power to live your life in a certain way in the future. So this is what I think Simondon sees as characteristic of this prophetic mode, whether it's in the case of religious, in a proper sense, religious practices, but also in the case of science fiction.
I don't know. I think the science fiction seems to be underlaid by a kind of progress, whereas the religious seems to be underlaid by a cycle of birth and death, of not forward moving. It's cyclical. It has this notion, as he says. Where is it from? Past to future, the wave falls, cycles to spring. So it has this kind of more circular nature in it.
Yeah, I think. These are again. So the religious mode of or the religious use of prophecy is not identical to the science fiction use of prophecy, or the prophetic nature of science fiction is not identical to the prophetic nature of religion. So of course there are differences in terms of how they are manifested. But I think this prophetic nature, this use of the future, this sort of affective resonance of the future in the present to transform the future. I think this sort of process, or this cycle within the prophetic use of the image is common to both the religious use of the image and the science fiction use of the image for Simondon. I think that's how we're meant to understand this these couple paragraphs here.
I can start the next section if we want to move on.
Yeah, sure. Let's read. So about a page. Yeah, we have a couple of shorter paragraphs.
Okay. Section B, the hypothesis of the genetic dynamism of the image, phases and levels. Studies of ontogenesis have shown that growth processes do not cover the organs and functional systems of a living being in a uniform way. There are lags in each partial growth relative to the others, and there are different speeds, especially among complex organisms, so much so that it is difficult to establish the exact moment at which an organism reaches its complete adult stage. Moreover, growth and development display stages and cycles separated by periods of transition in which a de-differentiation is followed by a reorganization. Such processes are very clear in the metamorphoses of some living species, yet they also take place in the organic development in the ontogenesis of human behavior. Could we not then posit that mental images are like structural and functional subsets of this organized activity that is psychic activity? The subsets would thus possess a genetic dynamism analogous to that of an organ or a system of organs on a trajectory of growth. And we could essentially distinguish three stages. First, that of pure and spontaneous growth prior to the experience of the object to which a functional activity is pre-adapted. This would be, in the image, the equivalent to the embryonic stages of organic growth. Each image, as an embryo of motor and perceptual activity, develops itself for itself here as a non-controlled anticipation through reference to the experience of the milieu and to a free state, which is to say without strict correlation to other subsets of psychic activity. It displays pre-adaptations but not adaptations. The image then becomes a mode of receiving, accueil, information coming from the milieu and a source of response schemas to these stimuli. In perceptual and motor experience, images become effectively and directly functional. They organize and stabilize themselves in internally correlated groups according to the dimensions of the relationship between the organism and the milieu. Finally, after this stage of interaction with the milieu corresponding to a learning process, an apprentissage, an effective emotional repercussion completes the organization of images according to a systematic model of linkages, evocations, and communications. A veritable mental world is constituted, with regions, domains, qualitative key points through which the subject commands an analog of the exterior milieu, one that has its own constraints, its own topology, its complex modalities of access. In other words, images would undergo successive mutations that would modify their mutual relations by making them pass from the status of primitive mutual independence to a phase of interdependence at the moment the object is encountered, to a final state of systematic and necessitating linkage in which primitively kinetic energies have become tensions within a system. Invention could then be considered as a shift in the organization of the system of adult images, returning mental activity to a new state of free images through a change of level, thus allowing a genesis to start again. Invention would be the rebirth of the cycle of images, one that permits an approach to the milieu with new anticipations from which adaptations will emerge that were not possible for primitive anticipations, and then a new internal and symbolic systematization. In other words, invention operates a change of level. It marks the end of a cycle and the beginning of another, each comprising three phases: anticipation, experience, and systematization. So this is interesting in light of the last thing that we read from Individuation Volume 2, where he also talks about these cycles of differentiation, de-differentiation, and reorganization in human development. And the idea here seems to be that along with this this sort of cyclical but also developmental process in human development, there's a subset, a structural and functional subset, that is the psychic activity, which includes the genesis of images, which has its own cycle and its own moments of de-differentiation, which I guess correspond to invention, which allows a new cycle to begin. So yeah, I think someone said this in one of the earlier sessions, but maybe it's more of or maybe it was at the end of the last book, but it's more of like a spiral development than a circle that always returns to the same point.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was going to say about the spiral. So he's pointing back here, that first paragraph here, he's pointing back to some of what he's discussed in form information potentials, that was the last text that we read in Individuation Volume 2. So in that text, he looks at some results from developmental psychology, which shows that human infants, for example, they go through a series of stages in terms of their motor activity, so their way of getting around the world. So an infant at one stage, at a certain age, will crawl on all fours and is quite successful. Anyone who's a parent will recognize this, that infants, manage to get themselves into all kinds of trouble by crawling around, and are very good at getting around the world by crawling. But then at a certain stage, that crawling behavior sort of breaks down, and they start to pick up their arms off the ground, and they are sort of awkward and can't really get around as well as they did before. And then after a while, they start to walk on two legs, and then they can get around on two legs just as well as they did before, crawling on all fours. So their behavior sort of has this well differentiated, or this well adapted state, and then it undergoes the state of de-differentiation, so it becomes awkward and maladapted to the environment, and then it re-differentiates and readapts to the environment in a new level of adaptation, or a new structure in bipedal locomotion. And Simoneau sees this as being characteristic of the development of human behavior in general, that we go through these cycles of adaptation and then de-adaptation and then readaptation at a new level. And then the proposal here in Imagination and Invention is that we treat the development of images as if it was the development of an organism in the same way. So an image it's as if the image were a kind of organism within our mental life. And then each image, or each set of images, will undergo a similar kind of development through cycles of adaptation, de-adaptation or de-differentiation, and then readaptation at a higher level. So yeah, each of these images, or each of these sets of images, will undergo this sort of spiraling development, where it continues to go through these cycles, and then each cycle takes place at a higher level, than the preceding one. And so again, this first bit is a sort of summary or preview of the more detailed explanation that he's going to go through in the rest of this section. But the idea is that we start with an anticipatory image that so we have an image before the encounter with the object, and this image has to do with sort of so he calls this a priori, in the sense that it's images that are before the contact with the object, and he connects this with instinctive tendencies that are discovered by ethology. We'll see this in a little bit. And then there's the image in the encounter with the object. So this image has to do with adaptation of between the image and the object. So you have a well-adapted perceptual apparatus insofar as your images depict the world in the way that it actually is. And then after the encounter with the image, after the encounter with the object, the image has this memory quality, and then in that memory state, it undergoes relations with other images. So you, in a process of learning, for example, the first time that a child sees a dog, for example, they have some sort of reaction to this dog, but then afterwards they sort of grasp the concept of a dog. They might compare multiple experiences of seeing dogs, and then they learn what a dog is in general. And so this learning process involves connecting multiple different images with each other and integrating them with each other. But then the invention stage, or the invention step, is a sort of kicking the cycle up into a higher gear, or moving it to a higher level, where you restart the cycle with these anticipations that are not connected to each other, and then you progressively tie them together into more coherent connections, or more coherent structures of images. So each of these cycles operates at a certain level, and then it gets pushed up to a higher level through a process of invention.
It's very interesting, this, because it seems to be complex. It seems to be kind of structural, and it's this structure which the image is something that kind of development, and it's development on a level, and then it goes up to another level. The process begins again. A really interesting image idea, I think. Obviously, it's familiar with Simondon. From my understanding of Simondon, is that it kind of talks about systems, signals, and sign signal. I mean, this is from but this signal sign systems operate in a certain way. It's kind of cyclical and going up to different levels, the energy levels, and I think intensive systems. That's the word I'm kind of struggling to remember, to think about. I don't know if it creates different levels of intensity, but this sort of as you say, it's this development of an organism. It's early to spontaneous growth and then interactions, and then it becomes a world in itself. The process starts again. It's kind of a complex of robotic thinking, religious thinking. It's quite strange, the kind of the things that are being combined within this analysis, I would say.
Yeah, I think one of the things that's so interesting and well, sometimes difficult about Simondon, but that makes him such a rewarding author to go through, is the way that he makes these connections between domains that you would not think are connected to each other. So biblical prophecy writing and cybernetics, just sort of a priori don't seem to have anything to do with each other. But he's now making connections between them and allowing us to see how we can sort of get something out of this connection between the two. And so I think this is also a sort of an example of the process that he's describing here. So we start with maybe a certain understanding, a set of images about what biblical prophecy looks like or consists in, and then we have another set of images about cybernetics and information theory and signal processing and so on. We have images related to that field, and they're sort of isolated from each other. They just have their own sort of consistency, and they have no connection with each other. And then in our process of learning through reading Simondon's work, we come to make connections between them. We integrate those two fields, and then through that integration, we can perform an act of invention, or Simondon sort of guides us to perform an act of invention to grasp a higher level of intellectual life, I guess, to sort of ascend to this higher level of intellectual life through, by passing through this integration. So yeah, he's sort of doing what he's describing for us, or he's pushing us to do what he's describing here, which I think is a kind of neat sort of performative structure of his text. Okay, so let's go on to the next page. Do we have any volunteers to read the next page or so?
I can read. Where do?
So we're on page 19 near the bottom. Each phase of the Genesis.
Okay, fine. And how long paragraphs?
Yeah, about a page. Let's see, where does that get us to? Yeah, let's go to the top of 21, the first paragraph on 21.
Each phase of the Genesis be placed into a dominant active before the experience by the image as anticipation is rich in endogenous motor element. It is connected to the hereditary coordinations of movement revealed by ethological studies. Its intensity may thus vary according to levels of motivation up to a hallucinatory mode of appearance and action, as in the case of Leerlauf-Reaction or vacuum activities in ethology. In this sense, we can speak of a priori images, and the predominance of primary motor elements in this activity is to be associated with the fact that in species development, and perhaps individual development too, motoricity precedes sensoriality as a long-term anticipation of behavior. In the direct relation with the milieu, the image provides the local activity that is a mode of reception of incident information. This short-term anticipation, constantly adapted and readapted to the situation, adjusted to the structure of objects in the form of a pre-perceptual or interperceptual schema, is marked by the predominance of cognitive content. By analogy and an extension of the vocabulary, we might speak of a presenti images, which may in some cases be manifested in a separate state in the form of errors or illusions, but which normally pass unperceived since they are at the surface of perceptual activity. After perception, the affective emotional effect, or resonance, takes priority. The image is then the remarkable point that is preserved when the situation no longer exists. We might speak of a memory in this a posteriori image, and indeed the category of memory images, with their capacity to revive situations from evocations of the image, is not new in psychology. But we should note that not all memories are images. A memory is a true a posteriori image when it appears as an imprinting, pregnance, and with an intensity that endows it with an organizing power. This particular memory is a remarkable point that holds a meaning for a topology of the system of past experience in the process of organizing itself. It is a source of attitude reactivation. It has qualitative power and presents itself as a sample of a situation rather than as a memory of an experience. Through this image that preserves an objective density and contains a reference to the alterity of experienced reality, the subject preserves and retains in himself an analogon of external reality, one that may materialize itself as a caricature, a devotional image, or a work of art. The emotional density and the sheaf of qualitative nuance incorporated in this particular memory constitutes a charge, a state of the system that conserves and condenses at once both the spontaneous endogenous movement of long-term anticipation of the a priori image and the heterogeneous plurality of the perceived brought by experience. This synthesis in equal proportions of endogenous motor energy and information coming from the milieu is a concrete symbol of the relation between subject and milieu. This particular mix represents a point of insertion of mental activity in the milieu. It condenses a situation, preserves it with its network of forces and tendencies, and allows that situation to be recreated. In this sense, the world of memory images produces a true mental universe, or rather constitutes the terminals, born, and the wiring, voyez, of a mental universe that is polarized, polarisé, and under tension, tendu. And I apologize for especially my French pronunciation.
Yeah, no worries about the French. That's obviously not you're not expected to master the French pronunciation. So here he's talking about. So again, he's going through this cycle of the image in more detail. So he gave in the last bit that we just read before, he gives a sort of condensed account of this cycle in one go, and then he goes through each of the moments of this cycle. So the first one is the anticipation, and so he ties this with this ethological concept of the vacuum activity. So ethology is the study of animal behavior, and he's thinking here primarily of Konrad Lorenz, I believe, who was a famous, one of the founders of the field of ethology in the 20th century, and he gave this account of animals that perform. So there are certain behaviors that animals that are specific to a particular animal species. They will drink water in a certain way, or catch their prey in a certain way, or perform certain sort of mating rituals and so on. But sometimes these activities, the animals will actually perform the same activity in the absence of the object on which the activity is based. So he talks about, I think it was starlings, that that their normal or one of their normal foods is insects that are flying around. So they sort of snap at insects from out of the air. But even in the absence of insects, when their hunger is strong enough, they will actually start snapping at the air as if there were insects there. So they perform their actions without having the object present, and this is what a vacuum activity is. And so Simondon is taking this as a sort of instance of this anticipatory role of the image. So it's as if the starling is sort of hallucinating insects that are surrounding it, and snapping at these hallucinated insects, and other sort of instances of animals that perform these vacuum activities. That it's as if they're hallucinating an image, and acting in relation to this hallucinated image. So this is the sort of anticipatory phase of the image. It's an image that has no connection to the rest of the mental life of the organism. And then the second phase is when the image is connected to the milieu in in an adaptive sense. So here the animal, whether it's a human or some other animal, will not just have this sort of direct link between a certain behavior and a hallucinated image, but instead will have this sort of feedback loop between the environment and the behavior. So, like in the case of the starling or any other animal, they have a certain prey object, so they perceive the prey object. They might have certain behavior to approach the prey. They have a certain type of behavior to capture the prey, to eat the prey, and so on. Each of the steps of the whole process of capturing and eating prey has certain types of behavior that are guided by the perception. So the image of the insect guides the behavior, and then that guided behavior produces a new image of the insect from closer, or in the right posture or whatever. And so there's this sort of cycling of between image and behavior to bring about the desired goal state of whether it's eating the prey object, or mating with the partner or whatever. We have this sort of constant adaptation of the image to the object outside of the organism. And so Simondon calls the first set of these empty images, these hallucinated images, he calls this a priori, because they're prior to the contact with the object. These images appear before any sort of contact with the object. And then these images that are in relation to the milieu, that are adapted to the environment, he calls these a presenti. So this is a term that we've seen in Individuation Volume 1, that Simondon introduces this term a presenti to sort of fit between the terms a priori and a posteriori. So yeah, we have these a presenti images that present an adaptation to the environment, and then the next stage is the a posteriori image. So this is the image after the encounter with the object, and this image has an affective power, and so it serves. So he says not every memory is an image in this sense. So there's learning that happens. The image is incorporated into our sort of future behavior. So an animal that encounters some situation for the first time, say fire, the animal encounters fire for the first time. They may not have any understanding of what it is, but then if they get too close, they will experience pain, and then in future they will avoid fire. So this situation brings about an affective response, the pain of the approach to fire, and the future situation, whenever this animal sees fire from a distance, it will have a sort of resonance of that past experience and will avoid the fire in the future. So there's a learning process of how this image gets incorporated into the future behavior of the organism. And this, so Simoneau sees this as sort of this process as being taking place in human behavior as well. When we see things like he talks about caricatures or devotional images or works of art. So these types of images are not sort of photographic depictions of a situation. Even what we think of as realistic art is meant to produce a certain kind of response in a human audience. It's not just a pure depiction. No one paints a realistic painting just to depict, what some random human beings in a particular room were doing at a certain time. You select, the person that you want to depict and the situation in which you depict them. They're selected to produce a certain kind of reaction in a human audience. So each of these images sort of highlights particular aspects of reality or emphasizes some aspects while hiding others, or sort of depicts aspects of reality in a particular way to bring about a certain kind of emotional reaction in a human subject who learns from that experience and then has their behavior modified in future. That experience of encountering even a sort of crude caricature of a person, it might make you see that person in a different way in the future. You sort of realize, yeah, this person does have a big nose or whatever, that you didn't see before this caricature. So your mental life is transformed by passing through the phase of encountering this caricature, and so we have this affective response through which we learn and transform our mental life.
The reference to feedback in the second moment, this might be a stretch, but I wonder if the critique of cybernetics in Individuation Volume 1, which, as I understand it, is basically that you can't understand the human being, or I guess information in the broader sense in which Simoneau wants to understand it, through feedback loops. That point that he makes about how
strong image
contra Aristotle,
this thing as a tendency.
Hi, Derek. I was
it's got in
the middle of talking.
Yeah, Derek. Sorry, can you
polarization?
Sorry, Derek. Can you hear us?
A strong image, I would.
Derek,
and kind of brings all that thinking together.
Yeah, sorry, Derek. I'm going to mute you for a minute here because it sounds like you can't hear us. I think there's a connection issue. Yeah, sorry, Angus, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I wonder if
Can you not hear me?
If the critique of the. Oh,
Hear me?
I can still hear Derek. I don't know if maybe you just muted him personally. No.
Oh,
Hear me?
really? Okay. Oh yeah, here we go. Sorry, I have the server mute him. Just a sec.
Yeah. So the critique of feedback in volume 1. I wonder if this is related to the critique of the anticipatory demographics and economics planning that we saw in the last section, with the potential for reorientation, which I think is what Simondon thinks is missing from the sort of self-directed reorientation that Simondon thinks is missing from the understanding the human individual in terms of feedback, with that potential being associated with the futural moment of the image and imagination.
I think I think there's for Simondon there's definitely a role of feedback in bringing about this this sort of capacity of the future to transform the present effectively. So we need feedback to have this relation to the environment, this a presenti relation to the environment. We need to have feedback from the environment to have this connection to the environment. But it's we need something aside from pure feedback. We need this sort of productive role of the future. This what he calls here the prophetic power or prophetic use of the image to be able to sort of get beyond just an insertion into the environment or a pure adaptation. And he I forget which text it was where he talks about how, or he criticizes certain approaches to psychology for emphasizing adaptation overemphasizing adaptation. So a social reality. So you adapt to social reality just by getting a good job and being a good neighbor and so on. Like all these sort of typical things that you consider to be part of what adaptation to social reality is. But that social reality might not be a good social reality, or it might be one that could be improved in certain ways, and it might be better sort of in the long run, or for society as a whole. It might be better to have maladaptation at a certain stage, so that society can be transformed in the future. So yeah, I think the feedback bit is part of how we actually connect with an environment and have a relation to that environment. But at the same time, we need to have something that is not purely feedback and that sort of might be in some respects a maladaptation, to be able to sort of transform that reality and not just have a pure adaptation to that reality. Okay, yeah, so it sounds like Derek is back. So I'm going to unmute you, Derek, if you
Sorry
want
about
to make your comment.
No, all I was saying earlier was the final bit of this section we reading seems to be a very strong image. I might call it an intensive system. It talks about terminals wiring, a polarization and tension within this whole structure.
Yeah, he's using again. This is something we've talked about a couple of times about his use of images in this text, which is appropriate because it's a text about images. But the image that he's using here comes from electrical engineering. So he's depicting the sort of mental life of an organism, or the mental universe is the term that he uses here, to as if it were an electrical system that has different connections between different components, wiring from one piece to another. And then, tension here. I think I mentioned this last time or a previous session. The French word tension means also can mean tension in English, but also voltage. So it's, again, an electrical term. So he's describing mental life as if it's a kind of electrical circuit or electrical system But it's precisely because mental life. So it's in this sort of cycle. Mental life tends to become sort of more connected. It's as if your wiring diagram gets more and more connections between different elements of your circuit. But then there's this invention phase, which is not really a phase of the cycle. It's a sort of extra cyclical phase, I guess, where the wiring diagram gets scrambled again, and then at a new level of reality, you have to sort of rewire your diagram again and form a new circuit. So you have this constant cycling between a sort of isolated set of components, and then you sort of wire them together and produce this complicated wiring diagram, and then you sort of scramble everything again, but at a new level, and then you go through the same cycle again. So that's sort of the image that he has in mind here of this electrical engineering sort of process. But then there's always this invention phase, which is not sort of captured in that image of the electrical engineering cycle. Okay, so let's go on to the next page. So we're at page 21 at this universe. If someone else would like to read from there. Okay, so no volunteers. Yeah, I can read again. No worries. Okay, this universe in which movements linked to exogenous structures have become forces and energies in a state of suspension in the mode of potentiality is an analogical organization of symbols. When the subject is saturated, unable to receive new experiences, he must modify his structure to find larger, more powerful dimensions of organization, able to surmount the felt incompatibilities. When invention, as a change of level, is unable to take place and develop a new cycle, the failure of the structural change of the symbolic universe manifests itself in pathological modalities. Such a general hypothesis of the genesis of images might lead to a dialectical interpretation. The a posteriori image has the characteristics of a synthesis, but the dialectical aspect of the relations between organism and milieu is only a partial aspect of the process of genesis. The phaedic phase, anterior to experience, translates the spontaneity of the organism and the pre-existence of an anticipating activity deployed prior to experience. Experience is already an antithetical phase corresponding to the tightest relationship between organism and milieu. In other words, one might think that a deeper study of the relations between organism and milieu might help us understand the origin of the dialectical schema and consequently lead to situating it, to relativizing it, rather than preserving it as the unconditional principle of the intelligibility of becoming. If the idea of dialectical evolution can be conserved, it is above all as an affirmation of a progressive succession of modes of organization of images across different phases, such modes of organization being so many, quote, logics, capable of providing anchor points for reflective and systematizing thought. If invention can affect a change of level, we need to define the main levels at which the dynamic genesis of images might be located. The primary level might be called biological or vital. It implies the participation of the entire organism as a means of actualization, and it engages that organism in situations through categories like the relation to predator, to prey, or to partner. Anticipation is in this sense the pre-existence of hereditary coordinations of instinctual action, like aggression or flight, that imply the participation of the organism as a whole. Perceptual experience is directed by innate forms or patterns, grasping the corresponding sense of situations according to the primary modes of danger, feeding, partnering, and domination or submission in social species. Resonance consists mainly of intensive apprenticeships, limited, however, to typical situations, such as those from the phenomenon of imprinting, Prägung, studied by ethologists. The secondary level, which may be called psychological, though the term is far from satisfactory, involves a more specialized participation of the nervous system in the local activity producing images. Instead of directly engaging the whole organism in each situational relation with the milieu, it develops a mental analog of this primary relation. Anticipation, rather than a waking instinctual activity, manifests itself in the form of motivation and conscious anticipation, of desire, of felt needs, of action plans, and through a succession of images that prepare the encounter with the object. In experience, the local activity producing images no longer functions as a mode of reception of primary categories of existence, but of the recognition and analysis of the object, of the perception of its present state, of the appreciation of variations and differences, and of the high differential processing of incident signals. The image functions here as an instrument of adaptation to the object. It presupposes that there is an object and not just a situation. After experience, the properly psychical image is the affective emotional symbol of the object, comprising the association of a representative trait with the modality of reaction in the subject. For instance, after a conversation, the images of a few words remain, a typical expression with a specific intonation by the interlocutor, joins to a specific affective emotional valence. This memorial complex serves as a reference for the organization of the representation of the milieu with its valences in the subject. Right. So he's given us. So we have one sort of tripartite schema that we've just seen in the previous readings. So we have the a priori relation, or the image before the encounter with the object. We have a presenti, the image in relation with an object, and then we have the a posteriori image after the encounter with the object. So that's the one sort of tripartite schema that we've gone through. And then now he's going to give us another tripartite schema between, so first the biological level. So this schema has to do with levels at which the invention happens. So we can think of sort of cycles of the first tripartite schema going through each stage of the second tripartite schema. So you have like A1, A2, A3, B1, B2, B3, C1, C2, C3. That's sort of how we can think of these two schemas interacting with each other. So the first level of this second schema is what he calls the biological or vital level. Here we have, so he says it implies the participation of the entire organism. So here he's thinking of behaviors of the whole organism, where so you have responses like flight or predation or mating or something like that, where the whole organism is involved in the behavior. And then the second level he calls the psychological, where and he says this term is far from satisfactory. So I'm not sure exactly what he thinks is not satisfactory about this term, but the idea is that rather than a response of the whole organism to a situation, you instead have a relation to an object. So there's a sort of mental response to an object. So you sort of produce an analog of the object in mental life, as opposed to having a direct relation to the object in the environment. And so he goes through the different forms that anticipation, experience, and memory take in this sort of mode at this level. And then we'll see the third stage in the next reading, which will probably be next week. But the third stage is what he calls formal or reflexive use of the image. But we'll get into what that means next time.
I thought this point in the first paragraph that you read about these images that I guess saturate the subject and seem insurmountable and require the invention of a new level. I think that one way, in addition to the religion example that he gave earlier, another way that you can think of this purely cyclical reproduction of images without invention is something like trauma, in the sense that Freud discusses it in Beyond the Pleasure Principle, something that engenders this compulsive pathological repetition, and that requires an invention of some kind through analysis to, I guess, bind. I think the way he talks about it in that essay or that book is binding the traumatic energy so that it's no longer just free energy running around the psychic system. But that may be a kind of invention that leads to a new level that reorganizes this previously purely cyclical organization.
Yeah, that's a good connection to make. So he has talked in volume 2, or in volume 1 of Individuation, he talks a little bit about pathology, mental pathology. So he talks about dédoublement, like, I guess, split personality. So there's a bit of discussion of mental pathology in volume 1 of Individuation. But here he's giving not so much an account of pathology, but one kind of pathology, which would be to be unable to pass to a higher level. So you go through the cycle of anticipation, to experience to memory, and you sort of progressively tie your images together, and you go through all the structuring, but you can't go through that invention step and move on to the next level. And yeah, so we can think of this as, like an instance of trauma, where people are sort of stuck with a certain image. They can't get away from this image, and that image might sort of undergo this connection to all the rest of their mental life. You might like avoid all kinds of situations because they remind you of the thing that you're traumatized by. It might sort of go through this whole process of structuring your mental life, but in this pathological sense, because you can't actually get beyond that image. So I think that's a similar type of phenomenon as the one that Freud is talking about. But it'd be interesting to see, and Simondon talks about Freud in a few places, but it'd be interesting to look at like what a Simondon style therapy would look like. Trying to help subjects to be able to invent a new relation to the images in their life, and to invent a new form of a new way of living, I guess.
It would probably look like shop class or something, like building radios.
Yes, I think he would see. He talks in some places about the value of appreciating obsolete technology. So not just sort of discarding something because it's no longer the sort of cutting edge or the latest model of iPhone or whatever. So taking these sort of obsolete technologies and really grasping how they work and repairing them and keeping them working and so on. He sees this as like a sort of valuable way of relating to technical objects. So I think his sort of version of therapy might consist in sort of repairing old radios and grasping their technical essence by doing that, and then having this better relationship with your environment by virtue of doing that.
I was kind of interested by the first paragraph of this section, and he says in the small previous paragraph, because he talks about analogical organization of symbols, and he goes, that first paragraph is quite kind of philosophical kind of analysis that then leads into the following paragraphs of levels about primary level and secondary level. So, he says he says that such a general hypothesis of Genesis image might lead to a dialectical interpretation. To me, it seems to be saying that it might be the route we can go down, but it seems to imply that it probably isn't the route you should go down. So he says it's a posteriori, the characteristic of a synthesis. So it's something kind of affirmed through this analysis, this a posteriori image. And the other thing he talks about is the dialectic, about the relationship between organism and milieu, which was something that was previous section. So I'd like to get clearer on the kind of organism and the milieu, this kind of relationship. Then he goes into a kind of analysis of that, which leads to the next. We've only read 2, but the next 3 sections.
Yeah, the concept of dialectics is an interesting one in Simondon, because we've talked about this a few times in Volume 1. He, on certain occasions, he is somewhat disparaging about dialectics, or he sort of wants to differentiate himself from what he thinks of as dialectics, and he says, what I'm doing is not dialectical, or he says, this, like in this context here, he gives a sort of limited account of what dialectics might consist in. So he says, this aspect of reality might be sort of what dialectics is grasping, or what dialectics is based on. But then there are other passages where he actually describes his own work as dialectical, or where he takes on this term dialectics as suitable for his own work. He seems to have a sort of ambivalent relationship to the concept of dialectics, and it's also notable here that he takes on, and he does this in other places as well. He conceives of dialectics in terms of the thesis, antithesis, synthesis schema, which is not really how Hegel presents it. If we're taking Hegel as like the exemplar of dialectical thought, so this sort of schema is, Hegel would see this as being an overly sort of formalistic approach to dialectics, because you're sort of presupposing this set of categories and then kind of imposing them on the world. And so Hegel doesn't conceive of his own project as doing something like that, of finding a thesis, antithesis, synthesis structure in everything. And so Simondon is sort of working with this kind of traditional interpretation of Hegel that maybe doesn't work that well as a Hegel interpretation. But he's saying here that there's a certain respect in which the structure of ideas, or the structure, the genesis of images that he's presented, might sort of remind you of a dialectical process, or it has certain similarities with this dialectical process conceived as a progression from thesis to synthesis, to antithesis to synthesis. But he then says, even though there is this sort of partial resemblance or something like that, it's only partial. And he thinks that a deeper understanding of the relationship between organism and milieu, which is what he's going to go into in the next sort of tripartite schema that we read the first two parts of. This deeper understanding of that relationship will sort of go beyond dialectics. And so dialectics is a kind of superficial account of development for Simondon, or in this bit of Simondon at least. He sees this dialectical progression from thesis to antithesis to synthesis as being a kind of superficial grasp of only one aspect of this organism-milieu relationship. And when we have a better grasp of the different levels at which this relationship occurs, then we sort of get beyond dialectics. So that's what we'll have to see more about next time, because we're just about out of time. But so we've gone through the first two levels of this schema, and then we'll see the third one next time. Okay, so we're pretty much at 2 hours. So let's stop here for today. So we'll pick up from page 22, I believe, is where we stopped. Yes, the bottom of 22. So thanks everyone for coming out. Hopefully we can get a few other people to read next time, but no pressure if you don't have a mic, or for whatever reason you don't want to read. But it would be nice to have some variety of voices, so that it's not just me talking all the time. I encourage you to join in if you feel comfortable.
Bye.
Thanks. See you next week.